Order, order. Thank you very much to the three of you for coming to give evidence to our Select Committee this morning on net zero. Can I start the questions by asking all three of you what you think of the net zero targets set out by the Prime Minister last week? Maybe start with you, Isabella O'Dowd.
Hi, thank you very much. We were pleased to see the Prime Minister step up to the challenge of net zero and put it through legislation. We believe that the UK can go faster. Our position has been net zero by 2045, and we commissioned some analysis by Vivid Economics last year that showed that our priority now is to really see the short-term policy actions to get us on track so we can achieve it as soon as possible.
Thank you. Baroness Worthington.
Thank you for inviting me to give evidence. I think we were very pleased with the CCC's report when it came out and recommended a 2050 net zero target. And the government's response has been it's appropriate, but we don't think it goes far enough in the context of the caveats they've put around it. And by that I mean that they are not committing to domestic action. And it's important to note that the CCC's report was based on the concept of domestic action. So if we're moving away from that, then it turns it into a much bigger question around the morality and the political reality of what we do to tackle climate change and the emergency we find ourselves in. So in that context, with how the government's presented it, net zero by 2050 isn't enough, and we could go much further.
And what do you mean by not committed to domestic action? Can you just explain that in a bit more detail?
So the Treasury has, we assume it was the Treasury, has insisted that we keep international carbon credits on the table in terms of meeting that target in 2050.
So, in practice, we could pay somebody else for their carbon credits so we could produce more carbon than otherwise. And what about things like aviation and shipping?
So we think the government should have included it in the SI. There's no reason why they couldn't have done. And as we understand it, the CCC already takes account of the amount of emissions that come from aviation and shipping internationally. So just adjusting the budget should have been done.
Thank you. Gail Bradbrook.
Hi, thank you. We think it's a testament to the effectiveness of radical campaigning, so really thanking the school strikers and people like that who've put this agenda on the map. We think it's an example of dishonest, half-baked and institutionalised thinking that's holding us back, that we've all got a responsibility for, and that there's some kind of bottleneck here that we need to remove. We think this is an issue of national security and it needs to be treated as such, and an appropriate response is a wartime effort. And in that way, quoting Sir Winston Churchill, it's no use saying we're doing our best, you've got to succeed in doing what's necessary. We don't think it's fair. It runs counter to Paris Article 4.1, where we said that developing countries would have to reduce later, and so the onus is on us to move faster. Basically, our understanding is that the target gives us a barely 50% chance of avoiding a 1.5 degree rise in temperatures according to what it says in the paper. That's just not acceptable.
Okay. And what do you recommend? What does Extinction Rebellion recommend, Gail Bradbrook?
We're recommending an emergency response, and we're recommending that we aim for a target in which the British public can see that it's been treated as an emergency. We've said 2025, and we're asking for a citizens' assembly to look at how feasible that is and to look at the policies that would be needed. We think that current political processes are failing us, and that we have to do something entirely different here.
Thank you. And what would be the benefits, do you think, Gail, of adopting that more ambitious target that you would like to see?
You have, I mean, there's a place here where it feels like a charade having this conversation, you know what I mean? I mean, we know that we're killing life on Earth. We know that our children are probably going to face a future where there's no food on the shelves. We've got really credible commentators talking about the collapse of civilization in our children's lifetime as a result of not taking immediate action, emergency action. I mean, I can quote lots of facts and figures at you, but it feels like, I feel just heartbroken sitting here in this kind of conversation in a way. You know, there's this process that we're doing, and that, you're here for your role, but we just have to listen to the children that are begging for their lives and get real. I mean, I think that British people can do a wartime effort, and they will do if they're told the truth.
And Isabella O'Dowd, you've argued for a 2045 target for getting to net zero faster than the government currently envisage. What do you think are the benefits of having that target?
Yes, I think net zero is a great opportunity for the UK to sort of show global leadership. We felt that 2045 was achievable. We commissioned Vivid Economics, and we looked at the previous Committee on Climate Change's advice, and through interviews with experts and literature, we looked at the areas where sectors could go faster. And we also looked at the IPCC report in terms of what they were saying 2050 globally for carbon. I think the main benefit for the UK is what the Stern Review highlights. The benefits of strong and early action far outweigh the economic costs of not acting. And since we've seen the UK commit to its target, we've seen 18 EU countries show that they also support net zero. So I think leading up to COP 2020, we have a huge role to play in order to get us on track for 1.5 degrees as soon as possible.
And you, Baroness Worthington?
So we're advocating to go beyond zero in 2050, which means essentially drawing down and repaying some of the carbon debt that the UK has contributed to the problem. And the advantage of doing that would be that we'd start to set a framework for policy that actually steps up to the plate in terms of what's necessary. So I completely agree with Gail that there's a moral and it's just a moral question as to what we're going to do to step up to this. There's technical advice, there's economic advice, but ultimately the atmosphere doesn't care where you abate, and it doesn't care where you save abatement. And we're going to have to set up a system in the UK that is world-leading, that shows we're going to take our own contribution to zero and go beyond that, so make the scale of the response commensurate with the scale of the science.
So I think you've said, Baroness Worthington, that by 2050 we should be taking carbon out of the system, not just net zero, but beyond that. Yeah. Is that right? And can you explain what that means?
So we could set a target for minus 120%, for example, in 2050. And that would be recognising the fact that we have now lost the time window we had to do this by just reducing emissions in an incremental way. We're going to have to move into a different frame of reference, which says not only do we need to radically reduce emissions, but we're going to have to do all that we can to make the natural sinks and appropriate human actions to draw carbon out of the atmosphere a viable option. And the UK is very well placed to do that, given that we're leading some of the research and we have all the tools in our policy toolkit that we need to do this.
And what sort of things can you do to take carbon out of the atmosphere?
So the IPCC relies heavily on something called BEIS, which is biomass with carbon capture and storage, which is essentially using biomass, combusting it, capturing the CO2 and drawing it down. But actually some of the best forms of capturing carbon from the atmosphere are natural systems. So priming the biological pumps that are already in existence, whether they're in the oceans or on land, tree planting, it's an old idea, but rewilding of our natural environment. These are all ways of helping move the carbon balance back in favour of nature and back in favour of humanity.
I mean, to what extent does it worry you that we're not on target to meet our fourth and fifth carbon budgets at the moment, and those are budgets set on a less ambitious goal? If we move towards net zero by 2050, obviously those carbon budgets will need to be updated. If we can't even meet the targets we've set for ourselves at the moment, are you confident that we can do this? And how would we need to do things differently compared with what we're doing today? If we continue with you, Baroness Worthington.
So the contribution we make to climate change is the area of emissions under the curve, which means the trajectory of emissions that you take towards your target matters. And we've taken a kind of slow start, which means we're going to have to rapidly speed up. So those last three budgets, 7, 8 and 9, are where you'd start to move into zero and negative territory, because you're going to have to describe a curve that looks something like this to get the lowest amount of volume under the curve. Basically what that means is we've started slow, we need to speed up. And actually the technology teaches us we can speed up, because we're now setting a target of 100% at the same cost estimated cost as we thought 80% would cost us only 10 years ago. So all the signs are that this can go faster towards the middle to the end of this process.
And I guess, Gail Bradbrook, you would say it was a lack of leadership and a lack of effort, and that we're quite capable of meeting those carbon budgets. But does it concern you that we're off target against our current ambitions? How much do you worry that we're able to step up to what you want to achieve?
I mean, I think the premise of this meeting today is clean growth, and, you know, to quote Greta Thunberg, she says that we keep suggesting the same daft ideas that got us into this mess. We have to think really out of the box, and I think that the first thing to do is talk to the British public about what's actually really going off here. And, you know, British people have stepped up in times of war when they've been asked to. We will miss targets when, you know, even today you've got the announcement of the Heathrow consultation for the third runway. You know, even today you've got that we couldn't put even 1p on fast fashion, rejected. You know, it's just, there's a complete cognitive dissonance going off between the reality that we're killing ourselves. I think also it's really important to think about agroecology and what it means to think about the fact that Britain's one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. This is not an issue of physics and carbon atoms, it's an issue of our relationship with nature. And fundamentally, I know I sound like a bit of a daft hippie saying this, but it comes down to how much we're willing to love people in other countries and look at what's happening to people when, you know, there's mass death and destruction happening already. And the fact that we've been unable to really face and deal with that and our role in that. I mean, the UK was the 5th biggest emitter internationally over the, you know, lifetime of emissions. We have a moral responsibility there. But if we're not going to really love people in other countries, we're not loving our own children either, we're not loving our own nature. And I just think there's a kind of real disconnect between reality here.
Okay, thank you. Mark Pawsey.
Chairman, all of our witnesses here have used the term we, and I understand that you've been using the term we in the context of the UK. Now, Gail, you just said that the UK was the world's 5th biggest emitter, but last year, in 2017, the UK was responsible for just 1.2% of world greenhouse gas emissions. So this is clearly something that we can't do on our own. And the question I have for you is, why should the UK move further and faster than other big emitters, those who can have a big impact on the world situation, people like China and the USA?
Well, we keep saying that we're going to show leadership here. And when I say we're the 5th in the world, I'm talking about our history. I've got 2% down as global emissions, but we give 15%.
So we're a relatively small proportion.
Just a second, thank you. 15% of global fossil fuel finance comes from the UK. But I think the point is let's show real leadership here. Let's not wait for other people to get on this train. Extinction Rebellion's in 58 countries. There are people protesting. I mean, you know, in Extinction Rebellion, we say we're in active rebellion against the government. You know, we don't recognise the social contract anymore, because just as my job as a mother is to keep my children safe, your job as government is to keep the British people safe, and targets like that just aren't going to do that. And it's not about, you know, blaming China or the US, especially with what I've just told you about fast fashion. You know, it's all these embodied emissions in consumption as well. You know, let's be honest about the emissions we're doing here, and let's absolutely do our best, and not just because it makes sense for climate change, but because it makes sense on a whole raft of reasons if we're going to focus on biodiversity loss at the same time. Let's stop breaking these issues up as if they don't have the same root cause.
Okay, Baroness Worthington, if we take this action, are other countries going to immediately follow our lead?
Yes, I think they are actually, and they have already. When we set the Climate Change Act, we were the first in the world to do that, to legislate for a target, and others have followed suit. So Sweden and New Zealand, and we've seen just today 18 out of the 27 member states of the European Union saying that they're backing a net zero target for the whole of Europe. So people are following. Japan has also just come out. But I think the bigger question, though, is why do we need to legislate in the UK? And that's because of our political economy. If you're China, you don't need climate change laws. You just make it happen. You make the capital flow and you bring in a plan that's a 50-year plan and that you act on that basis. Now,
so why aren't they doing that?
They are. If you look what's happening in China, there's a huge shift happening. Now, they're doing lots of things, all of things at once, so they're also building out new thermal capacity, but they're massively increasing their nuclear and renewables capacity. And it's starting, we think, this year we're starting to see the thermal coal reducing as a result of those two new technologies.
Will they be adopting the same targets as us?
They don't need to adopt targets. They have central planning. We need laws because we're an open economy that our companies are going to be the ones who are responsible for delivering this. They need a really strong, loud and legal framework in order to know what to invest in. And that's why the Climate Change Act is necessary. If you look at the US, they have a completely different political economy where they allow new entrants in far more readily than Europe does. And they can use innovation policies and they will allow disruption in far more readily than we do. So why does Europe need laws? It's because of our political economy, and it sends a signal to our companies to then know what to invest in.
Okay. And to pick that up, Isabella O'Dowd, we're the business committee, so we have an interest in the competitiveness of our businesses, and we're interested in the jobs of the people that work in them. How can you look British workers in the eye and say that the proposals that we're arguing for might make the businesses that you work uncompetitive and may affect your job security?
I mean, I think we've seen very strong business support for net zero throughout this whole period with the CCC's advice. Over 60 companies submitted evidence, their call for evidence showing support. And just in the last few weeks, we saw 135 businesses send a letter to the Prime Minister saying that they supported the CCC's advice and that they need long-term targets in order to transition so that they can bring their employees and their industry, into that net zero world so that they aren't leaving people behind. I think one point that's also interesting on this whole why should we go further than other countries if they're not? I mean, I think it's a no-brainer. In the last sort of 25 years, the UK has been one of the most successful countries in growing its economy and cutting its emissions. So I think this is actually an opportunity, and it's an opportunity for companies to, grow in the green economy and really sort of take on the challenge of net zero in a very positive way.
But you will be aware that the steel industry in the UK, for example, is under pressure, and one of the challenges they face is very high energy costs in the UK compared to their international competitors. It's inevitable that the measures that are proposed to achieve this objective will have an impact on energy costs. How are you going to look those workers in the eye and say that we're supporting you in keeping your jobs?
Well, I think the first step is I think we should be supporting the cheapest forms of energy, so solar and onshore wind.
But we may not be able to adapt fast enough in order to sustain the industries that are currently under pressure. Would you agree?
I think we can adopt fast enough. I think that's what we put in our Keeping It Cool report, a pathway. There are a lot of examples in other countries where we're seeing this happening. And I think the technologies are there. I think we have got enough time to make that step, and that's why we need to have urgent action from policymakers but also from businesses to make that change.
And quickly enough to save the threatened steel industry?
Yes, I think we need to look at how we can make that just transition in terms of using low carbon technologies and adopting industry in order to achieve that.
I just wouldn't want it to stay unchallenged that it's the carbon policies that are making steel uncompetitive in the UK. There are massive issues to do with economies of scale and competition from other countries who've actually invested in new capacity that's much more efficient. The thing that the steel industry got wrong was assuming that climate change would just go away, and it hasn't gone away. It's got much more serious. And what they should have done is assessed a zero carbon plan early enough to have been able to invest in it. They had all the opportunities they could need.
Are there competitors around the world
We've just described how other competitors are doing
plans.
it. Not everyone relies on the rule of law to make progress. So if you look at what India's doing in terms of their steel capacity, they're investing in new, cleaner systems. There are ways of making steel without the need for burning of coal, and that you can use electric arc furnaces. We could have easily, instead of shipping our steel off to be recycled on the continent, we could have kept the steel here and built arc furnaces which would have run on clean electricity, which would have helped balance the grid. So it's a lack of imagination, it's a denial at the very top that this is a real issue. And I'm sorry for the workers, absolutely, but they've been misled by their management. And we should have been much clearer about the policies we needed to get them to move to innovative systems.
Bring Gail Bradbrook in and then move on to Drew Hendry.
I'm just not okay with this idea that we set the environmental movement up against workers and ordinary people. This is one of the most unequal countries in the world, and actually when you have the inequality that we do, we're in the top 3, people are less interested in focusing on climate change as a direct correlation as it happens. The father of neoliberal economics, Milton Friedman, said that he really liked the idea of a market-based economy celebrated because there would be no concentration of power through market forces and therefore no harm would be done. So I am totally behind Milton Friedman's vision of let's not concentrate power and let's not do harm. But we have to look at this system. That why are we so focused on economic growth as an idea, and that we have to have this kind of job or that kind of job? We know government policies have destroyed more jobs in the renewable industries than the steel industry, but essentially this is not about the green movement versus workers. This is about a just transition and looking at completely different ways of thinking about how humanity lives on this planet. Because if this could have been delivered by some kind of clean growth thing, or in a way that's not going to affect our economy, then I think we would have done it. And I want to quote Winston Churchill here, actually, because it feels like that phase of appeasement that we've been in for years, where he says, owing to past neglect, in the face of the plainest warnings, we have now entered upon a period of danger. The era of procrastination, of half measures, of soothing and baffling expedients, of delays, it's coming to a close. In its place, we are entering a period of consequences. And again, I keep saying it, but I really think the British people will do whatever it takes if they understand that everything that they hold dear, everything that they love, is at stake. Then they'll step up. British people have done it before. Even in the era of Brexit, they're talking in that way, the dig for Britain spirit. So I think it's there. You folks just have to be honest. And perhaps I can add one final point.
Okay, then we'll need to move on to Drew Hendry.
Which is that as I said earlier, I really sympathise with civil servants and MPs and business people and people in institutions who have to kind of toe some kind of line. I mean, I've worked those jobs, I know, I'm part of it as well, I've been there. Extinction Rebellion is going to be developing a platform for whistleblowers so that civil servants can actually tell us what's going on behind the scenes, what you know. For example, about food security. You only have 4 people in the UK looking at food security. We've got multi-breadbasket failure on the horizon. 4 people. Whistleblow. Tell us the truth. Tell us the truth.
Drew Hendry.
Thanks. I'm interested in finding out what the panel feels about the Committee on Climate Change's analysis and what specifics that you disagree with there. And picking up on Gail Bradbrook's statement earlier about thinking outside of the box, what specifically about the Committee on Climate Change's net zero report is not ambitious enough? And maybe if we can start with Baroness Bryony and then...
it is quite an ambitious report, and it is very detailed, and they've got a team of experts who've really applied themselves to this question. I think it's things that have not been able to be included because of complexity that I would say we need to take more account of, because you can't pretend this is a precise science. You're forecasting out 30 years from now, And we've already seen our forecasts of 10 years ago were wrong. So we've got to enter into this in a spirit of humility and knowing that what we think is cast iron science isn't cast iron science. We're into a period of risk. So I think probably a little bit less emphatic statements, this is the only path, or this is the only target, would have been a little bit more honest with us about the fact that we're dealing with error bars and we're dealing with risk. And I think in that context, one of the things that would have made a difference would have been to acknowledge that technology costs are a huge uncertainty. And everything we've seen about industrial innovation has shown that those costs come down rapidly when you deploy at scale. And the UK and Europe has had a big hand in helping that to happen across different sectors. So those cost estimates, they appear to be some sort of truth, but they're not. They're a projection with starting assumptions. And I think I would have liked to have seen more scenario testing on those cost curves, because once the cost curves start to come down, it gets a lot cheaper, and then we can go further.
Okay, Isabella O'Dowd.
Yeah, we were pleased with the level of ambition that we saw in the CCC's advice. It showed a real shift. We obviously support 2045, which I've done some analysis. You can actually make the case for 2045 from the Committee on Climate Change's advice when you look at all of the speculative options. I think the big areas that we kind of feel strongly that you can go further on elements such as diet change. In their further ambition scenario, they have 20% reduction. In our Keeping It Cool report and their speculative options, they talk about a 50% reduction. We're already seeing that. The Waitrose survey showed that a third of Britons are already becoming vegetarian or flexitarian, so reducing their meat consumption. So I think areas around behaviour change and lifestyle, things that we're seeing the general public already making that change. The other area which we think there's more of a role for nature-based solutions. So in our report, we had a much larger greenhouse gas removal savings from afforestation, habitat restoration, and soil carbon sequestration. The CCC's advice has a very small amount. I think it's -2 megatons of CO2. So we think this is a key area of protecting our biodiversity and making sure that we are sucking carbon out of the atmosphere through nature-based solutions.
Thank you. And Gail Bradbrook?
Thank you. I think there's an issue with this idea that the committee is independent because, in my understanding, it has to report again based on the government's industrial strategy. And so when you've got the expansion of Heathrow justified on the basis that we're going to have a load of bogs, I think, in Wales, we need that to happen anyway. We need not to use that to justify aviation expansion. And relying on carbon capture and storage technologies that aren't real, they're being called magical thinking in science papers in Nature, right? I mean, I know there's some test versions out there when we know that the soil is an amazing carbon capture and storage mechanism. I think the biggest thing we need to do is work with our farmers, actually. I think relying on IPCC reports, which we know always, they underestimate things that are already happening, and we have to use the precautionary principle. This is not a time for taking risks when we're talking about the actual fate of humanity. You can't then balance economic practicalities out. So focusing on carbon capture and storage technologies is, in my opinion, a terrible thing to do.
Okay, well, sticking with you then for the next question, which we'd like to ask the other members of the panel as well. You've just said that you're not a fan of the technological solutions. You would like to see other things happen just now, if that's right, correct, particularly
that's a personal opinion.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So are the Committee on Climate Change's assumptions about potential for behaviour lifestyle change appropriate? Now, you've mentioned kind of a wartime blitz spirit. Should we expect the public to do more?
Well, I think that we should expect a certain proportion of the public to do more in particular. I think ordinary people are really on their knees in this country. They are finding it really hard to cope with the stress of the pressures that are on them. And that we know that 50% of carbon emissions come from about 10% of the population. If you limited the carbon footprint of those top 10% of people to an average European, this is a global emissions figure from Kevin Anderson, it would reduce emissions by a third in a year or two. So in the UK, you've got a certain section of the population that is doing a lot of frequent flying and is eating a high carbon diet and so on.
Right, but just to clarify, do you think the assumptions about behaviour and lifestyle are appropriate that have been made by the Committee on Climate Change?
I think, you know, as you know, that we're talking about a citizens' assembly and we want people's buy-in to that process. We want people to come up with the solutions. But as an example, I think you can expect that people will change their behaviour, as a colleague said. You know, that's already happening. But I'm saying that we should focus on the people who are doing the most emissions.
Okay. If I can come to Isabella O'Dowd then on that same question, again about the Committee on Climate Change assumptions about the potential for behaviour and lifestyle change. Are they appropriate? Should the public do more?
Yes, I think we saw a shift in the latest CCC report on behaviour change. It is an area that people find quite hard to model. And I think what they have in their further ambition scenario versus their speculative options, we would very much support the speculative options around diet change, demand reduction in aviation, afforestation. So this is a key area for us at WWF. We think you do need public to be part of the solution, but we also need leadership from government in order to make sure that those decisions are easy and appropriate for the general public. You know, we're seeing sort of shifts already, alternative transport models across the EU, and that is a key part in terms of behaviour change in order to achieve net zero.
And do you think the committee's assumptions are correct then?
I think on the speculative options, I think they're closer to what we put in our Keeping It Cool report. But I think, again, it's an area where it's difficult to model. So I think if we're already seeing that shift in diet change from the general public, that we may even be able to do that faster than the 50% reduction. But I think we're seeing general public more engaged on these issues of climate change and actually looking to us for solutions on how they can change their lifestyle.
Okay. And Baroness Bryony?
To be honest, the behavioural change is not something I've looked at in a lot of detail. I assume always that it's important for government to take a lead on these issues. We haven't really got time for X million people to wake up one morning and think, I'm going to change my lifestyle. You need to create price signals that mean that those choices become automatic. And choice editing, actually. So we're much more focused on the structural policies that will enable people to make the right choices and not lose out. And also on the fairness question, we've got to ensure that we bring people with us in this response. We can't have the costs of making this transition fall on those who can't afford to bear the cost. So I can't really comment on the CCC's assumptions, but I would say we should give ourselves focus squarely on policy.
Okay, thank you.
So your focus, Baroness Worthington, would be to use signals in the market to change behaviour, so you price things to reflect the true cost. That's exactly. Fair to say. Can I just pick up on Gail Bradbrook's point about carbon capture and storage, because I was quite surprised by your response there. Our Select Committee visited Middlesbrough and Redcar, I think it was the end of last year, and we believe that carbon capture and storage has a role to play in taking carbon out of the atmosphere and also supporting some of those industries that won't be able to survive if they continue to be big emitters of carbon and other pollutants. Are you saying that you don't think carbon capture and storage has a role in either meeting our carbon emissions or protecting some of those industries in parts of the country where, you know, frankly, there's a desperate need for jobs and well-paid jobs?
Extinction Rebellion believes you have to have a citizens' assembly to deal with this issue and look at all possible options.
You were very critical.
I'm going to answer. Personally, I think I wouldn't rule any technology out. I don't think there's any harm in looking at technological solutions. But when I was at COGX technology conference last week, you had a guy there asking for, I think, 200 billion globally for CCS technologies, and I always look at that in the face of nature, which is our carbon capture and storage mechanism. We are the most nature depleted, one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, And that's where the carbon will be stored. You don't. This is what I was trying to say. It's like putting it down to physics, as if it's just purely about carbon atoms. We've got an issue of water here. I mean, when you look at what the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, people like that talk about when they're talking about how to work with the land to make sure that you're dealing with water issues there as well as nitrogen issues, as other pollution issues, as healthier food. I think you really have to.
I understand what you're saying, Gail Bradbrook, but you say you want citizens' assemblies and to take people with you. I'm just putting to you that the people of Redcar and Middlesbrough, they may in principle be in favour of reforestation and getting back to nature, but they also need jobs to be able to feed their families and ensure that their children have prospects for the future. I just put into you that if you want to take people with you, you need to find solutions that go with the grain of human life and people's needs.
I mean, yeah, we're absolutely talking about a just transition and that nobody should be put out of work, but there are all sorts of different work that people can do. I mean, I come from a coal mining community and the whole industry was closed down and it wasn't a just transition actually. But I don't personally rule out technology, but as many scientists and engineers say, it's magical thinking about carbon. Just don't think we should be putting our eggs in the basket of a technology that's not proven at scale.
What about nuclear technology? Are you in favour of more nuclear power plants to meet our energy needs in a low carbon way?
I think, again, personal opinion is I think it's a bad idea given that nuclear power stations are on the coast and we know that we're going to get mass flooding, and given that many credible commentators talk about the collapse of civilization. How are we going to manage nuclear power stations in the face of a civilization collapse? I mean, I'm talking about Professor Schellnhuber, who advises Angela Merkel on climate change.
But they're opening new coal power stations. Their coal power production is increasing in Germany because they're not using nuclear power.
I'm talking about the commentator, not the German policy. I'm just saying that, why would you think of opening new nuclear power stations if, given what flooding we're expecting to see and given the possibility of a collapse of civilization? I mean, some people are saying it's inevitable, right? This is why the children are on the streets, because they think that what we're going to leave them is an impossible task.
And it's a very powerful argument, Gail Bradbrook, but I guess what we're trying to explore is what policies are needed and how we can do it in a fair way. I think there's a consensus that we need to get to net zero. I'm just putting to you some of the ways we could do that through carbon capture and storage and nuclear. If I ask you then, Baroness Worthington, what's your view on carbon capture and storage and also on nuclear to meet our energy needs?
So my main focus is on this happening quickly, and that puts an emphasis on proven technologies at scale and technologies that can be transferred to other countries, in particular China. So in that context, the UK moving ahead with demonstration projects on both CCS and new nuclear is really important. Whether the CCS will work, I think, is still open. The economics of it are quite harsh. And solar and wind are coming down at such rates, including then converting that into fuels, that you might find that CCS's day in the sun has kind of passed us by. There is an issue around gas, and I think CCS on gas is where we should focus. And there's a British technology actually that's been exported to the States to be developed in Texas, which seems to be showing that you can use gas with this technology with no net energy penalty, which means it will be cost effective. So I'm holding out hope that we'll get a best available technology on gas that is CCS capable. And on nuclear, I think the UK needs to hold the line.
Sorry, which means?
It means that we do not close early, we do life extension, that we look to seeing whether there's a new breed of nuclear that can be used safely in wider parts of the country.
And Isabella O'Dowd?
We think that, I haven't seen a scenario to achieve net zero without CCS, so we think there is a role for it, whether it's in industry or with technologies such as DAX. So we think we need to see investment from government, because we saw investment, it was taken away, and now the investment is nowhere near the same level. And we need to look at all technologies. We would like to, prioritise the nature-based ones, but we see a role for CCS. In terms of nuclear, I think there are enough models out there that show that wind and solar renewables are the cheapest forms of energy. We don't see a role for new nuclear, and we think that we need to be looking at the long-term energy solutions for storage. We've done some analysis to look at what you would need in a 2030 scenario, and that doesn't require new nuclear.
Thank you very much.
Existing nuclear.
It does require existing nuclear.
It does require existing nuclear. Move on to Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you very much. This is a really interesting session. Isabella O'Dowd, could you just start? What specific measures would it take in the short to medium term in order to deliver your net carbon zero target of 5 years earlier than the government is willing to meet its target? I suspect you'll be more specific than the government is right now, but what specific measures are you aiming for?
Yeah, we recently published our climate emergency package, which was a sort of list of policy actions for each department. If the Prime Minister was to declare a climate emergency, what we would need to see across government in order to step up to this challenge. I think in the short term there are some very easy policy actions that we need to see. We need to see support for the cheapest forms of energy, onshore wind, and we need to see support for solar. In the medium term, we need to sort of phase out fossil fuels with a just transition. We need to have that transition from dirty to clean technologies. One area that we did a lot of work on last year was pushing the government to commit the end of the sale of diesel and petrol vehicles to 2030. We think the 2040 target is not ambitious enough. Another key area where there isn't enough action is in buildings, so making sure that homes are built to the highest standard, and also making sure that we are putting enough investment to retrofit existing housing so that it's energy efficient. I think the ones that get us from 2050 to 2045 are the sort of diet change. It's looking at international agreement around aviation and shipping, and looking at international innovation so that technologies can come on sooner and faster.
Thanks. You'll be pleased to know that some of the recommendations you're outlining there are ones that are being supported by this committee. In fact, bringing forward the target on EVs in particular is one that this committee is led on. And in fact, on the 4th of July, we're leading this committee is leading a debate in the House of Commons specifically on electrical vehicle conversion and bringing forward the date. Bryony Worthington, could I ask the same as you? What specific measures would be needed in order to achieve your target?
I'm delighted you've asked that question, because when we were writing the Climate Change Act, we thought the day would come when we'd need new policies to make sure we could meet the targets in the budgets. And so we wrote Part 3 of the Act, which no one reads, but it's there, and it enables you to pass new policies that will do two things: either put a limit on existing sources of emissions, or incentivise investment into abatement technology, so things that reduce emissions, and that could be natural or technological. And those are all enabled, and you just need to consult and then use statutory instruments to bring them in. And what that means is that for those parts of the economy which are not decarbonising, and that means really transport and heat, you can introduce similar policies to those we've used in power over the last 10 years to bring our carbon intensity hugely down to the point now where we've got whole fortnights of coal-free power generation. So my simple message is read the Act, read Part 3, and then start a consultation on how we do this at a high level so that you're handing down the responsibility for meeting these targets to the private sector. And then the private sector will create the right financial incentives for everybody then to comply.
So is it fair to say that whereas WWF and other organisations have specific policy requests, you have a principle of governing? There's sort of a policy lock on all new legislation. Is that correct?
It's just, you just do what we've done in power. If you look at what we did in power, we started 20 plus years ago with the non-fossil fuel obligation. And why we did that was because we wanted to support existing nuclear. But we let in renewables on the back of it. And on the back of that, the first wind farms got built. The first landfill gas sites got developed. And then from there, we've now got a multi-billion-pound offshore wind industry through successive policies that have been sustained through different governments. And they got there by not picking winners, by creating broad-brush policies that enable companies to compete to deliver the most cost-effective solutions. What's not to like about that? And you've got to apply it to transport first, because cars don't pollute. The fuels that they burn pollute. And in California, they have a whole economy cap and trade system that means that the oil majors are responsible for the emissions they cause. We have the powers in the Act to enable us to do the same. We should take a trip to California, learn how they've done it, and do it here.
How would that apply to heating, for example? I mean, heating is like almost 46% of our emissions.
Exactly the same. It's the fuels that pollute, not the buildings infrastructure. You want to have good non-leaky buildings for sure, and building regulations need to be firstly increased and then enforced. But really, it's the fuel sales that cause the emissions. So at the point at which they are taxed into the system is where you regulate them. And a very low level carbon price would then be recycled into innovation to then mean you can buy down the cost of those technologies.
Thank you. Gail, you've got the most ambitious target of any of the witnesses here today. You've quoted Churchill a few times. You've quoted Churchill's sort of speeches, which were the aspirational ones, but Churchill was also very, very prescriptive in the policies that were going to achieve the ambition, the rhetoric that he was trying to lead the nation on. What are the very, very specific measures that you believe, bearing in mind that the question I asked of Isabella was, what are you going to do in the short, medium and long term? For you, there is no medium and long term. All of you want to achieve it is in the short term. So specifically, what measures are going to deliver this in the short term?
I mean, I do keep coming back to this point. The British people know what's happening. They'll do what's necessary. So when half of our food comes from overseas, 77% of fruit and veg comes from overseas, and extreme weather disrupts perishable food shipping routes. And Latvia had a state of emergency last year on their harvest. Lithuania said it was a national disaster.
So
all of these
are you saying
things,
a specific measure is no import of food?
No, the specific... I will answer that question, but the specific measure is, first of all, let the British people know that they're going to walk into their supermarkets, possibly in just a few years' time, if we've got what the academics call a multi-bread basket failure, and not have food on their shelves. And that's when the rioting starts, and that's when people panic, and fascism. So this is why we talk about a wartime economy, and that's why we think the shift has to absolutely move from this idea that we're going to do this within business as usual. We think that through a citizens' assembly you will come up with a package that people can get behind, because it'll have ordinary people on it who've been taught critical thinking skills and been given evidence. But as an example of what happened in wartime, there was the government concluded that it wasn't going to come from taxation. That's an unfair burden on the poor, and so they brought in rationing and went on to like a shadow factory plan, and there was more homegrown food.
So now let's just skip forward 70 years and say specifically what measures we need to do 60 years. No, she's talking about quoting measures from the war.
Yeah.
So rather than what we did in the war, what do we do now?
I'm not here to be like a think tank. You've got other people. You've got Zero Carbon Britain who've got examples. Norway have set their target at 2030 and they're not doing any more fossil fuel explorations. We could follow their lead. You've got Bhutan, and I mean, it's not my job to say this is what it should look like. We're saying we can't decide. You've got to ask the British people, given the...
Can I put this to you then? I mean, I'm a fan of citizens' assemblies. We should have been using them a lot earlier. And I think a lot of the issues that our country faces now, we could have navigated them without the divides that we have in our society if we'd used them. But you mentioned them many times. What happens if you do a citizens' assembly and they do not deliver the scale of ambition that you want? What happens if they see that and say, I am not willing to make the changes that you are demanding of us in order to make it, and we want to set a target which is 2050, along with the government? How will you respond as a campaigning organisation?
Well, I actually believe that won't happen personally, because I think if they look at the science and the facts, that they'll step up. Like I keep saying, I think British people step up when they know the reality. I think their children will get back out on the streets and say...
So my question is, if the Citizens' Assembly don't deliver the response that you want, what will your reaction be? Because there's no point giving power to Citizens' Assembly if you're not willing to listen to the outcome from them in the first place.
I mean, I think, but genuinely though, if the outcome is not realistic in terms of what we're facing, then you would get back out on the streets again and campaign for another citizens' assembly and maybe
that gives you the result you want.
No. I mean, I think the point is, I think what's likely to happen is that it would come up with some fact, like, some idea that might be like 2027 or something. It would say, well, we couldn't quite make that, but we've gone a bit further. But the point is that they would be seen an emergency response. I think it's the equivalent of saying, imagine there's 20 Hitlers, because this is far worse than one Hitler. 20 Hitlers lined up, and the British people would say, no, we won't do anything until 2050. I just can't actually imagine that would happen personally. But sure, if it did, I'd still be campaigning for something else to happen beyond that, because I know that that's not reality.
Okay, thank you, Jo.
Anna Turley.
Thank you very much, Chair. Isabella, I'd like to focus, if I may, on the WWF report. You've already given us some kind of examples of what's in there, but could you tell us a bit more about how you reached 2045 as your target, and what additional measures on top of what the government have proposed you'd like to see to get to that? And also, particularly, could you focus on what's outside the government's control as well in terms of behaviour change that you mentioned?
Yeah. So last year we commissioned Vivid Economics to look at what was the earliest date the UK could achieve net zero. We commissioned Vivid because the two consultants were ex-CCC, so we thought it was a sort of good starting point in terms of looking at the CCC advice. We started by looking at their previous scenarios, so their 80% target and then their max deployment target, which is a 90% reduction. And we looked at the areas that had really sort of progressed since that last analysis. So mainly that was through literature, examples from other countries, and we did lots of expert interviews with key people, academics and industry experts across the different sectors. The kind of main areas that we managed to reduce emissions were power, industry and agriculture. The sort of overall pathway, which is pretty aligned with what the CCC's advice is, means that power, transport and heat practically need to get to zero by 2045. Industry, agriculture and shipping and aviation need to reduce, but you can't get them to zero. So then you need to look at the greenhouse gas removal technologies that can then offset those emissions. So we mainly focus on nature-based solutions as WWF. That's a key area for us. And we limited technologies such as BECS to make sure it was only sourced from the UK and as sustainable as possible. I think we were keen to highlight that we want to cut emissions as much dramatically and as quickly as possible, so we don't have to rely on other technologies such as BECS. And that we think the UK can, if you look at previous trends, cut those emissions from the sources. In terms of how we got to 2045 compared to our 2050 scenario, 2050 was very much in control of what the UK government looks at. The main differences for 2045 were the diet change, so 50% reduction, looking at if you had an international agreement on shipping and aviation, the emissions that you could save from that, and also if you have international drive on technologies such as DAX or other technologies, they do come on faster and therefore you can move faster and further. So those are kind of the key areas that are outside of government's control, but I think the UK definitely has a role to play, and whether that's the international aviation and shipping or driving those technologies and really, being a fast mover in those areas.
And when you say driving those technologies, what sort of incentives would you like to see? What kind of tools and leverage does government have to encourage and drive this behaviour, both in terms of industry and investment, but also in terms of the wider population?
Yes, I think the UK government has an important role to play in terms of giving innovation funding towards these new technologies. We've briefly talked about stuff like CCS. I think it has a role to play, if we look at being ahead of the time, so that we make sure that we're making the most of that in terms of economic growth, the jobs it can offer. If we look at stuff like electric vehicles, what it can offer to the UK by being ahead and committing that money up front, but then, having those jobs available and the money it can feed back into the economy.
Thank you. And could I pick that up with you, Brian, particularly around the incentivisation for businesses? You mentioned earlier about industries not moving quickly enough to decarbonise. What would you like to see government do to support that transition and support our businesses in making that move to lower carbon? And also, I noticed we've talked about CCUS, no one's really mentioned hydrogen. Could you say something perhaps about the role of hydrogen in heat and transport as well, if you think that's relevant?
Yes. So essentially, we've power is now largely decarbonising. We've still got a way to go, but we're seeing the end of coal, and we're going to be using more and more clean power and balancing the system to make sure that we make the most of our renewables. The next challenge is oil, which is used in transport predominantly, but there is still some in heat, because you've got to work through the carbon intensity question, which is what's the most polluting fuel, because actually you'll get your best bang for your buck in terms of getting that off the system if you replace it with zero emissions. So getting oil out of transport is the biggest challenge. And now, we'll get to gas essentially after this, but in that sense you've got to learn from what we did in power. It's a highly capitalised, very mature market where everyone is already being served with the service they require. You can argue that there's a lot of congestion and there are lots of externalities, but by and large, a huge amount of capital is working to get people from A to B. So in that environment, you've got to force disruption. And that's why you need obligations. So if you look at, I'm happy to bring forward the banning date to 2030, but actually what I care about more is 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. We're selling less than 1% pure electric vehicles at the moment. We're trying to get to 100% by, let's say, 2030. How we're going to ramp up? The way we're going to ramp up is we're going to have to force innovation into that market by creating obligations. And whether we put that on the car manufacturers or whether we put it on the retailers of the fuel to pay for it, is a moot point we can consult. But we've got to create a financial incentive that says we are decarbonising transport, not in a kind of 30 years from now time frame, but in a tomorrow time frame, because that's the only way that we'll get back up onto that curve. Now, it won't just be one policy. The policy I outlined, which is this broad-based, economy-wide, that gives you the backstop, that makes it possible to meet ambitious targets. But what you do with the revenues from that and how you incentivise individual technology breakthroughs can be through a combination of issues to do with obligations that drive people to change their behaviour, targeted incentives, but also regulation, just choice editing. If something's polluting, hurting children's lungs, and has no place in a modern city, let's just ban it out of our environment. And because the technology is now there, enable us to have combustion-free cities, and that would be better for everybody. It would boost productivity. It would reduce the burden on the healthcare costs that the air pollution causes. Great for climate change. So that's my prescription in the near term.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. Bryony, can I just come back to a point I raised at the beginning, just because I wanted to clarify it, on the use of carbon credits. What is needed at an international level to ensure that any use of carbon credits is robust? You said at the beginning that it meant that even the targets the government is setting don't require domestic action if you can purchase those credits. What would you need to either stop those or make sure that they were used in a robust way?
So there's a policy answer to that, and then there's a technology answer to it. In terms of policy, if we are going to be trading internationally, then we'll need a really robust set of rules at a UN level. So it's in the jargon of the UN, it's Article 6, which sets the rules for how, if you purchase an allowance from another country, that country can't also claim credit for it. So it's called double counting, and you basically need a ledger, international ledger, that keeps track of all of this if you're going to do it. So I'd want to see, when we host COP26, us putting a huge effort on making sure that rule book is really robust and that it's signed up to by everybody. On the technology side, I'm all in favour of lots of natural system carbon sinks, but how do you know they're actually working? One of the real forcing factors of climate change is that natural sinks could become sources and not sinks. We're seeing risks of forestry in Canada, for example, switching from net positive for the environment to net negative, as in emitting CO2. So we're going to need sensors, and we're going to need really smart systems to ensure that we're actually monitoring these things that we think are helping, whether that's under the water, on the land, on our soils, in our forests, that enable us to give us a reasonable chance of knowing that this is actually a permanent and real storage, and that the minute it stops being, we have to then revise our rule book.
Thank you. Antoinette Sandbach.
Gail has already described a war effort approach. Would you, Isabella, support a war effort approach to climate change?
Yes, I think we highlighted that in our climate emergency package. We are in a climate crisis. You know, the general public are really waking up to that. I think the recent Greenpeace study that showed that 2/3 of people in the UK recognise we are in a climate emergency really highlights that. So in our climate emergency package, we do call on the Prime Minister to make this a priority across all departments and to step up to this in a war effort, yes.
And Bryony, how about you?
I'm not a big fan of war analogies, I'm afraid, and you know, no disrespect, but a lot of people died, and it's not a good thing to be really harking back to. I'd rather us go much further forward on a positive vision for combustion-free economies, and that's entirely possible. And it's in the grain of what the companies that we, you know, our own homegrown companies are already on this agenda, and if we do it well and we support them, they will be exporting to countries around the world. The idea that we're going to go back to rationing and enforced kind of hardship makes me slightly worried, and I think you quickly lose the political envelope within which you can act. That's not to say it's not urgent at all. It is hugely urgent, and I do agree we need to tell the public the reality of the risks. But I think we then need to double down on what the UK is good at, which is innovation. I mean, we started this whole thing. We invented the combustion engine. The Industrial Revolution started in Manchester. I want the green Industrial Revolution. It's already started. We've just got to speed it up and then export it.
So you've touched on some of the issues around the risk of losing public support. I know, Gail, again, I heard your evidence which said you just think that the public will step up to the plate. What evidence do you have to support that? Because certainly when we were looking at a high cost of energy prices, I remember going and knocking on doors, and I would, you know, part of that was green levies that were on people's bills. So what evidence do you have to back up your support that in the UK we may have rationing, and we're responsible for 1 to 2% of world emissions, and other countries may not be doing the same sort of things?
I don't. In a wartime economy, rich people have to cough up. That's what happens. So I don't think we need to say.
So the whole burden's going to fall on the rich, who might move out of the UK or relocate their resources elsewhere.
Well, we run the tax haven economy from the UK, so we could sort of deal with that to start off with. There's quite a lot of money there, and also the amount of fossil fuel subsidies that we do with are worse in the UK for that. So in Europe for that. So I think there's money available that if we want to. In terms of public opinion showed 63% agreeing we're in a climate emergency. Comres 54% saying that climate breakdown threatens to extinguish our species.
I know that doesn't deal with paying. That deals with identifying the problem.
Yeah.
And what I'm asking is, you know, that your analogy has been quite radical.
Yeah.
And what I'm asking is what evidence there is for you to say that you could bring the public with you.
Well, I think, you know, when you've got 71 councils declaring a climate emergency, the spectrum shifted. You know, people care about their children, and if you...
I have children,
sure.
But I also know that I live in an area where there's no public transport that's accessible, that, you know, if you're going to heat your home, you have to burn oil, and if you're going to replace your boiler, it might cost you £7,000 to do so. There's 17% rural poverty. And my concern is how you think that you could have that war effort without alienating large sections of the population.
Well, I agree it's an unfortunate analogy, and I think one of the dangers of talking about a war type of thing is that the idea that you're giving emergency powers to the government, which is why we absolutely balance it by saying you must have a citizens' assembly, you must have ordinary people chosen at random, you know, Fred the builder and so on.
I think you dealt with that with Peter. But when they get evidence, and when they get evidence of some of the impacts, on their lifestyle or their income, they may not choose to make those choices.
But it doesn't have, the burden doesn't have to be put on poor people. That's a choice that we can make, you know.
I understand that. I mean, Bryony, I don't know what your evidence is, or whether you've seen how.
Well, I mean, I think I'd like to sort of get us into some stimulus spending, but without, you know, you don't want to break the bank, but we are in a low interest environment and interest rate environment, and you know, there's a ton of capital out there waiting to find a destination. Bonds are not delivering what they used to, so you want it being serviced towards something, and a green industrial revolution is a perfect opportunity to draw that investment into the UK into green infrastructure. So I feel like there's an economic answer here which leads to a nice net win overall. For example, on the transport in particular, you know, we've just done some analysis with Frontier Economics around the take-up of EVs, which are predominantly middle class and rich people. So how are we going to get, you know, middle income, poorer families to be able to have access to electric vehicles, which are actually much cheaper to run and don't give you horrible MOT bills every year? So there's a sort of carbon poverty that we're not really acknowledging, which is that people are trapped into the petrol pump and running very, very cheap second-hand diesel cars. How can we get them as part of this? And I think the answer there lies in government policy to firstly communicate to people that they'll save money overall, but then perhaps a zero-interest loan, which wouldn't cost Treasury very much, would be certainly cheaper than the grants they're giving to middle-class people, facilitated in a way that tries to target it towards those most in need. That would be a very cheap win, and it would help diffuse this unfairness problem, which will come and hit us if we're not careful. I mean, just look at what's happened in France. So there are clever policies we can draw on. Scotland's already doing this, by the way. I don't see why it's not UK-wide.
Well, I think we may be coming up with recommendations in due course, but Isabella.
No, I just kind of wanted to pick up on that point. I think, you know, when we say a warlike effort, I think what we mean is sort of making sure that climate change really is a priority across government. We've seen it with other stuff like the Olympics, because it shouldn't just be, like you're saying, around transport. There are so many areas that this sort of fits over. It shouldn't just be BEIS that are championing this. And that's why we think that, there's a lot of positives in making sure that all departments are very clear about what aspects, whether it's their housing, transport, whether it's, you know, looking at having healthier diets in hospitals and schools. There's a whole wide range, and because we're in this climate crisis, we really need to see government step up, and there are huge benefits from, you know, better quality air, cheaper forms of renewables. So I think there is a positive element to this. It's unfortunate, the war comparison, but I think it's stepping up and seeing this as an opportunity to show action, because we don't think enough action is happening.
And given the recent Treasury letter about the so-called costs of declaring a climate emergency, or even trying to move to net zeros, how do you think the costs can be shared fairly across not just taxpayers but consumers and businesses?
Stay in Europe.
Sorry.
Sorry. A serious answer is, look, you've got to minimise the costs. You've got to get maximum bang for your buck. So the effectiveness of the policy is absolutely paramount, and that means, you know, unfortunately, creating signals to allow markets to work out what the answers are. And, you know, we can do a little bit of, you know, tinkering in terms of directing the funds that these prices towards, you know, if we have a fairly good hunch that we need CCS on gas, which we probably can say with some confidence we'll need, then directing some of that into a contract for difference that enables those investors who are ready to do that to do it with confidence that they're not going to lose their shirt. Those are the sorts of ways in which you can keep the costs minimised, keep it in with the grain of the investment cycle that companies are already pursuing. We've got a massive asset now of low carbon electricity that actually is producing more electricity than we need at certain times of the day and week. So we should be converting that into use in other sectors and making sure we're not trying to over-engineer a top-down policy from government, but allowing those broad signals to find the least cost solutions. Climate change mitigation is littered with examples where I was a civil servant, so I can say this, where civil servants think they know the answer and it turns out they haven't got it right, and the market comes in and surprises them and finds a much cheaper way of doing something than they could ever estimate with their graphs and economic assessments and lots of commissioned reports. So broad signals, brought in quickly, give the long-term signal the industry needs, and let's keeping the costs at a minimum so that the transition doesn't create... I mean, it's created a rebellion on a global scale, but no one's out on the street really saying they want to stop decarbonising electricity. We've done it over 10 years, and it's been a huge success.
Yeah,
What about you, Isabella?
I mean, I think we welcome the Committee on Climate Change has asked for Treasury to do a full analysis on this, because I think we really need to analyse how we can spread these costs, looking at private and public expenditure. I think, going back to what Nick Stern said, we need to see this as an opportunity, and we're keen to stress that review does look at the full benefits, the value of spending money on climate action. That CCC highlighted, moving faster, it will cost less in the long term. And, we talk a lot about the power sector, but that is a good example where, we did see initial support, and now it's, with decarbonising, and we're seeing in the next 3 years 50 billion of private investment in that sector. So I think we need to have a full assessment of where are we spending money on high cost, high carbon projects, and where could that money be better suited to make, people living in fuel poor homes more efficient, and making sure that it's spread well with long-term targets, so that business can plan and give that investment.
I think that's why we're calling for a citizens' assembly, because we don't trust politics as it currently exists to deal with this issue, because there's too many vested interests. When you've had things like the chairman of Quadrilla, also the non-executive director of the Cabinet Office, when choices were being made about fracking, this sort of current political system is captured to vested interests, and the premise of this committee being that the industrial strategy is a correct strategy or whatever. I think you have to take it back to the people. I don't need to labour that point again, but I think the other piece from our perspective is about justice, is about fairness. So what I mean,
can I just interrupt?
Sorry, I don't think the premise of this committee, or I don't think there is a premise of this committee on industrial strategy. The premise of these sessions is to explore the government's, in fact this inquiry was set up before the government had committed to a net zero strategy, so it was to look at the Committee on Climate Change's recommendations on net zero. Indeed,
maybe I'd misunderstood.
This committee is wholly independent of government. Wholly independent.
Can I
of
just
government.
check something? Because what I'd understood is that you can only do something when the ministers said to you to do a report.
No. We are sorry. Can I speak from the chair?
Yeah.
So I was elected by backbench MPs to be the chair of this select committee, and all of the members of this select committee are backbench MPs. None of us are either, and all elected, and none of us serve either on. None of us are either on the government or the official opposition's.
Maybe I've been misinformed, but I thought in your
bench.
terms of reference you had to. Maybe I don't know if it's that important a point actually.
It is an important a point for us.
But I thought in your terms of reference there was this thing where.
Angela, wait a second.
Because maybe I'm
Bradbrook.
wrong. Do you know what I mean? Let's just correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, that's what we are trying to do, Gail.
So, but what I thought was that in your terms of reference you had to come up with recommendations on within the framework of the government's industrial
that's absolutely not the case. And whether it's on our work on the collapse of Carillion, on the future of audit, on carbon capture and storage, on electric vehicles, on almost all the reports, if not all the reports that this committee have published, we have challenged and criticised government policy and put forward our own recommendations, and we do that without fear or favour to any of the front benches of any of the political parties.
I think my colleague behind me is correcting me that I'm mixing it up with the Climate Change Committee's terms of reference. So
okay, well, it's an important point to make, and I don't want us to look like we are in any way here to, with a prejudged view. In fact, I put down a bill last week on net zero before the government had committed to it. So
I think
it's an important point.
It's about.
Can we move on? I think Bryony Worthington wants to come in.
We said we're not going to.
Okay.
I did want to just pick up that fairness point because, there's obviously the sort of ideas of Green New Deals and jobs and so on, and therein lies a lot of detail to be thought about. But in our terms of reference for the Citizens' Assembly, we talk about climate justice, the idea that we can't just go and help ourselves to the sort of resources of in a sort of extractivist way of other countries in the world. We've got to think about this in a really internationalist way. What do other countries need from their own resources, not just a sort of UK perspective? And actually, given that food might run out in one country, one harvest in another, I think feeling really together on this.
Let's stand back.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Bryony, because you spoke about the market sending out the right signals, and that actually when you set the overall policy framework, supported by some cash, the public sector then came forward and delivered things in a way that civil servants hadn't expected or anticipated. My original question was really around the balance that those incentives are paid for by taxpayers effectively. Or
Don't need to be, no. Sorry, carry on. Finish your question. Then.
Well, again, how you balance it between consumers, for example, as well, and business.
Yeah. So some incentives are paid for out of the public purse, but they're in the minority. The vast majority of the billions that have gone into power decarbonisation have come from a mechanism which socialises the cost through everyone's bills on a very, very low level. And overall, what we've found is that pump priming exercise of a very, very almost unnoticeable level of levy on your bills, then directed into specific technology groups, brings the cost of those technologies down so fast that ultimately the consumer gets back to a net same position. And that's what we've seen now with the costs coming down of onshore wind and solar, and offshore wind also down on its cost curve. So it's a pump priming exercise rather than a hugely expensive public expenditure.
So those on the lowest incomes or fixed incomes are actually those that bear the biggest burdens on those bills.
Obviously, fuel poverty is a reflection of how much of your disposable income you pay on heating and carrying out your daily life with energy. That's true, but there are fuel poverty policies that come in to give people. You can use the receipts of these levies to both help improve people's standards of living and also drive innovation. If done well, you can actually make this a progressive policy, so you bring up inequality, you narrow inequality through use of the recycle of these revenues. So there's nothing that the policy, there's nothing intrinsically, essentially you have to start from the basis that money needs to flow to move things on, to get things cleaner, and then the question is how do we do that equitably? And putting on the public purse is one way, but as we know, that involves a treasury that needs to then see the value in that future spend today. If you could persuade the treasury, then that would be the most progressive way of doing it. But in this world, of where the treasury believes this should be defrayed into the private sector, it ends up on consumers' bills. That's the nature of the tension between treasury and
so if it's going to end up in consumer bills, and we have to really step up and have a real game change in approach to try and deliver on this target, are we actually going to, in reality, are we going to see that potentially impacting on those with fixed incomes and the lowest paid, as the Treasury seeks to defray it into the consumer?
If you don't have a corresponding social policy, but we have, in power, we've had, there've been payments made back to people. So, I mean, the example of transport is a good one, because if we are saying that we're going to be very, very narrowly, incrementally increasing the price of a litre of fuel because it's polluting and hurting our lungs, then we need to find those people who are climate poor, people who are trapped into this reliance on cars to get from A to B, to get to their jobs, who haven't got the capital available to purchase a cleaner vehicle, which would be cheaper to run but not cheaper to buy. Yeah. And that means policy. But those policies are possible and we can implement them, but we have to do them in tandem if we're going to keep this justice argument being answered.
And Isabella, you've spoken about the importance of natural capital, as it were, or natural carbon sinks. Given that much of that land at the moment is productive farmland and would need to either be reforested or changed in some way, how are you proposing that that would be paid for?
This is an area that, we see that farmers are at the front line of climate change, so they are seeing the effects, on the ground, whether it was the heat waves or flooding. We think we have a good opportunity with the Agricultural Bill and the Environment Bill to look at how you pay farmers for public goods in terms of making sure that their land is managed so that it can also continue to produce the food, but looking at ways that it can, use that land to remove carbon. I think what was interesting in the Green Alliance's latest report was that erosion and loss of organic soil content is costing farmers 903 million a year. So there's a benefit to farmers in terms of making their land more productive, but also sucking in carbon from the air. And I think, NFU have gone for a 2040 net zero target. We're very keen to work with farmers to look at the solutions in that just transition.
And how are you going to counteract public anger, potentially, where somebody who might own several thousand acres of farmland receives public subsidy or some form of public payment, where somebody doesn't really care about whether... Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I see what you mean. We can definitely write in with more information on this.
Thank you.
That'd
be helpful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Should we move on? Have you got any more questions, Antoinette? No. Vernon Coker.
Thank you very much. Can I just, we were talking about the involvement of the public and some of the issues related to that, which was very interesting. The Prime Minister has plans for a youth steering group to advise on priorities for environmental action. I think they've established 15 to 24-year-olds to do that. What do you think of that? And what should they be asking? And I mean, I'm also intrigued as where the 30 people came from and how we broaden it out and get everybody involved rather than, do you see what I mean? That sort of involving all sections of youth and all parts of the country. So anyway, I just wondered what your thoughts on the youth steering group was and what it should be doing and how it can be done.
Yeah.
Isabella, do you want to start?
I think the youth movement are critical. I think, they are the future generation and their voices are being heard and need to be heard within government policy making because, it is their future that, we're trying to protect in terms of the effects of climate change. My understanding is they're looking at bringing people from across the country and, this is an initial starting up this group. And I think making sure that those promises are followed through and those voices are listened to by government and by the policymakers is a really critical area, and I think we would very much encourage that.
Pulling them in from across the country is really important, Bryony, isn't it? Rather than just a group without being really, from London or whatever, that they pile in from everywhere.
Yeah, we haven't looked at this in detail. If you could reduce the voting age, that would help.
I agree with that, by the way. Yeah, I agree with that as well. But there we go.
But I think the key thing about what the youth committee should and will say, I'm sure, is listen. You're the adults. Can you help us out here? Because you've been looking at this for 20 years or more, and you've got access to all the civil service expertise. You've got people. You can do inquiries. Surely, what they need to do is create the political pressure to say sort this out and sort it out fast. I don't think we should be looking to them to invent new solutions, because it needs a maturity of knowing how and when we act to deliver this. It's going to have to come from experience as well as youth. It's got to be a whole society response. So I love the fact that they're being brought in, but they should be saying, come on, you're the adults, get on with it.
Can I add that young people rate environmental problems higher than adults, second to Brexit. I asked XR Youth people what they thought about that idea, and they said it's irrelevant if that is in any way tokenistic and if there's no process for the youth input to be binding or have any actual weight with the final decision. Otherwise, it's the same empty promises. Let's hear what the young people think and then make all the decisions about their lives and future while they're not in the room and have no actual say in the decision-making. That's how they sort of feel. And there are 40 chapters of XR Youth across the UK.
Gail, can I just ask, where was that from, the quote that you had?
That is their kind of perception. Of
so I just wondered, so was that young people saying that? Or,
yeah.
Where from? Do you just... It's not a trick question, I'm just interested.
No, sure.
Yeah. Do you remember?
I think Teddy's based in Leicestershire, but
Okay.
I'm not quite sure.
Okay.
And I guess we would say that a citizens' assembly would include youth participation, and that we really do believe in that mechanism whereby you teach ordinary people critical thinking skills and then bring in the experts. The experts have done the work, so it's a sort of partnership between the two. I would really want to make sure that a youth voice wasn't used as an excuse to tell the children to stay in school. I think the radical school strike action is absolutely needed to keep the pressure on.
Just in raising, whether it's Gail, just start with, whether it's young people or whoever participates in any citizens' assembly, what should the format of that be? What should people be asked, whether they're young, middle-aged or old? What are the questions? And then we'll just see what others think. You know, what would you say to them? I mean, is there an environmental problem? People would say yes, that's why they're there. But then what are the questions that would prompt some sort of the best outcome, if you like?
So the question that we've set at the minute is along the lines of how should the UK halt and reverse biodiversity loss and aim for net zero carbon by around 2025, whilst ensuring climate justice both at home and overseas and ecological justice. And then you bring in the experts. Yeah. But my understanding is you do this sortition approach where you choose people.
Do what approach? Sorry.
It's called sortition. You choose people by random. This is how Greek democracy was originally. Yeah. Was that you brought in ordinary people to examine the evidence.
Thank you very much. Bryony, do you want to add anything to that? There's the sort of thing that we should be asking people in the... I mean, that random selection of people in is going back to the Greek.
I think I'd ask them about how they absorb information and what information sources they find most compelling, because I don't think they're going to come up with the answers, nor should we expect them to. But I think what you could learn is about the things that are influencing their thinking, where they're getting their information from, what government could be doing more to inform them and to inform everybody. Because I think the advent of social media means that we've got amazing platforms now to talk to people directly, unmediated by press barons, etc. So I think I'd focus on that communications challenge, because we're into a whole new era now of information flow, and that must be harnessed, I think, to help us move this needle faster. So that would be an area they would have specialism in.
Yeah. Isabella, just slightly moving on from that, but how do we stop people being cynical about the assembly takes place and everyone comes and has a couple of days and discusses it? I mean, and then there'll be outputs from that. What would you expect from government or us, if you like, or anyone, in terms of how they respond to that? Because going back to Peter Carr's point, I mean, there might be 50 outcomes or 20 outcomes. You might agree with 10, not with 5, not with... So what would you expect to happen that would retain the integrity of the process?
It's a difficult question. I think transparency is key. I think we need to be very open and transparent around the decisions that have been made. I think a really good example is if you look at public support for stuff like onshore wind and renewables, it's extremely high, and yet it's banned by the government, and we're seeing fracking projects coming through. So I think, if you set up those systems and you have, I completely agree, if you have this youth steering group, it must not be a greenwashing exercise. They must really sort of take on board the messages that are coming through, that there's some transparency, and that, government are listening to the the people that are trying to feed in, who are on the ground and witnessing the effects of this.
Could I just clarify something about the Citizens' Assembly? It wouldn't just meet for 2 days. It's
No, sorry, I didn't mean. I was just
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's like a jury service, and bear in mind with the jury service, somebody's liberty is being decided, and you put that to ordinary people. The process, like I say, it's critical thinking skills, and my colleagues here would be invited. That this is the kind of colleagues that would be invited to share with ordinary people to get your points across. We have to understand that ordinary people can deal with information. You know, they can process it. So it's an involved process, like a jury service, and we really believe that.
Sorry, I was 2 days. It was just a sort of carry. I didn't mean it as 2 days. And that was the end of it. What I'm interested in, though, is whatever the process, is how you maintain the integrity, so people feel as though they actually really are contributing in a way which the government acts on and listens to and responds to. And I think transparency is one of the ways of doing that. Sorry, I thought it looked as though I provoked something else.
No.
Okay. Can I just move on about enforcement? The government has got various carbon reduction targets and commitments. What do you think of the existing enforcement mechanisms for that? Not strong enough, too weak? Bryony, do you want to start on that? Where do we go to with this? You might want to throw in Brexit and whether that leaves us with that.
The Climate Change Act, doesn't have a chapter on, a kind of enforcement because essentially you're relying on judicial review to keep government honest, and you're relying on what the Climate Change Act created was a kind of legal metronome of responsibilities that pass between the CCC and government to respond. And they have to do certain things by certain dates, and then they're open to judicial review. And that's preserving that is paramount. You've got to be able to challenge the government if it's failing on the law. In terms of sanctions, if they fail to meet a target, it's really the public sanction of Parliament and citizens, saying this is something we will take issue with in the courts. And then the redress. I wanted to have baked into the law a requirement for the Treasury to fund any redress with purchasing of abatement, three times the amount that's been over-emitted, as a financial incentive on the Treasury to see that this is not a zero-sum game here, that there will be a penalty if you allow things to drift and not bring in policies. Obviously, that would probably rarely be used, but I felt it needed something that would create that kind of tension in Treasury's mind, because it's very easy to just say laissez-faire and let's let the market deliver. And I think we needed something. I still think we need something that makes it much sharper in terms of the decisions we're making. So
the Treasury would have a power to act where somebody had failed.
No, it would have a requirement. To be on the Treasury to find the funds, on government to find the funds to redress for any over-emissions that were allowed. It doesn't exist explicitly in the bill, but if it were taken through a court system, that could be one of the penalties the court decided to impose. That was the argument that persuaded me we didn't need it in the bill. But I think it's. And we're going to see this with the Environment Bill, right? We're going to try and create a body that's meant to be keeping the government to account. And at the moment, the proposal is that climate change is not part of that.
Climate change mitigation is not going to be included in this Office for Environmental Protection, is it?
Yeah.
You think it should?
I can't see the logic of not including it, given that it's the overarching thing that drives a lot of other environmental issues.
Yeah. Okay.
Could I just
Yes, of course.
We'd also like to see the UK championing the law of ecocide at the UN level as the 5th crime against peace. It's a law that's already been drafted by a beautiful and brilliant barrister called Polly Higgins, who unfortunately died in April this year, but her work continues. And that would hold business leaders and people of significant public office to criminal account for not protecting people or for mass damage and destruction of the ecosystem. So you have 4 crimes against peace already, and ecocide was always supposed to be the 5th one. We think that having civil litigation is not good enough because business leaders and others just see that as a cost of doing business, that people have to actually be tried. So
you hold them to criminal account for...
Yeah, in the same way as crimes against humanity and war crimes and so on, that we need the highest possible law at this
and where does that go if that were... who decides whether somebody has done that or not, committed that or not?
I guess wherever crimes against humanity are tried, I guess it's in The Hague, isn't it? But I'm not sure.
Okay.
But, it would be great to see the UK champion such a law.
Okay, thanks. Isabella, is there anything you want to add to any of that?
I mean, I would support, climate change and environment must go hand in hand. You mentioned Brexit. If we do leave the EU, we must make sure that those emissions are continue to be enforced. We have got the Climate Change Act and the CCC, and we need to keep driving that as we achieve net zero.
That's fine, thank you very much.
There's a 5-year review mechanism that the government has suggested with net zero, and there's been some criticism of that if other countries don't follow us, then we might relax our own targets. But could it also be seen as an opportunity to perhaps move in the direction that all three of you want to move in, that after 5 years we could, if we legislate for net zero by 2050, in 5 years' time, we could then decide to bring it forward to a date closer to yours. Do you think that 5-year review is a good thing or a bad thing in the government statutory instrument? Isabella?
I mean, I would like to see it as a good thing. I think we will be able to move faster if we see urgent short-term actions now, if we see monies committed in the spending review coming up. I think in 5 years' time we'll see that other countries are moving faster and that the UK should step up to that ambition and set a new date.
Baroness Worthington?
Yeah, I'm in the same camp. I mean, the government can review at any time it wants, really. You can ask the CCC for its advice. I think the idea that we're going to go backwards from this target is not happening, and so it's only going to be toughening. I would just say that it's easier to change the number in 2050 than it is to move it to another year. So considering beyond zero is really important, and that is where we need to be in terms of the moral right thing to do.
That's a good point. So you could stick with 2050, but say, like you've said, Baroness Worthington, that it should be minus 120% by then. Gail Bradbrook.
I mean, obviously we want a much shorter target, so if there's any opportunity to make that happen sooner, then I guess that's a good enough reason. But given that the government over the last few years has been removing lots of environmental legislation and has done what some Green leaders think has been the worst 30 years ever on environmental policy, then there is always the possibility that you've got a government who would come into power who would say, OK, let's not bother with that anymore. So I see risks in it as well.
Mm-hmm. And the three of you, basically there's a range of targets, starting with the 2025 that you've set out, Gail Bradbrook, going to the CCC government 2050. Between the three of you on the panel, there's a 20-year gap between Gail Bradbrook's 2025 and the WWF's 2045. I don't want to sort of pitch our witnesses against each other, but do you think that you are trying to achieve the same thing, or are you feel like you are arguing for different things?
We had a chat beforehand. I think you've got some feminine leadership here, and for us, or at least speaking for myself, it's not about getting into a battle with other people. I asked Isabella if her target was fixed, and obviously that I don't want to speak for you, but as ambitious as possible. And it's our job in Extinction Rebellion. Sure, we'll be back on the streets in the autumn to shift that Overton window and to keep putting the pressure on to make it possible for you guys to say more ambitious things. You're talking within the current paradigm. We're saying that the paradigm has to shift, and there's a place where we're all together on that, actually.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, we support the level of urgency, and that's why we really need to focus on these short-term policy actions moving forward so that we can achieve net zero as soon as possible. We've been quite clear on that in our modelling.
Baroness Worthington?
And the spirit of unity but I think we're all in the same reasons, which is that we care passionately, that we do the most we can without, causing undue hardship, and that's the balancing act we're doing. The sixth carbon budget covers the years over the 2035, so you should be advocating for net zero in the sixth carbon budget. Engaging in that process, because the Climate Change Act is a process that doesn't stop and it keeps us going. So, it gives us opportunities like this, these moments where we can raise a flag and say we need to do things differently. But I think we all play different roles. Extinction Rebellion really are out there creating that, moving that Overton window to allow all of us to do more, as are the youth strikes. But we need to do more. That is absolutely clear.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that this committee is very much supportive of the need to get on with this, not just to legislate with a target, but to put in place the policies that are needed to achieve the target whichever year is set. And our committee have published reports on electric vehicles, on carbon capture and storage. We are shortly publishing a report on energy efficiency, and we've just started an inquiry on our energy infrastructure. In all of the recommendations we've made so far, the government have pushed back against what we've said, whether it's bringing forward the target for the phasing out of the internal combustion engine. And we know that if we're going to meet any of the targets that we've spoken about today, we need more ambitious set of policies. And our committee will carry on looking into the detail of all of these areas, whether it's on power or transport or heating or agriculture is not our area, but obviously an important part of achieving these targets, to ensure that we both deliver new legislation or update the Climate Change Act, but then quickly put in place the policies that we need to get there sooner rather than later. So thank you very much for the evidence today, which has been incredibly useful as part of our inquiry into net zero, and I hope that we can work together in the future to realise our ambitions. Thank you. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended.